Because this story really begins when Asgard, the world of the gods, was full of the fragrance of flowers and the plucking of lyres. A time where there were two things that reigned, two things that were sovereign. Odin, which is spirit, and Frigga, which is love. They were married, they were joined, and they ruled Asgard amongst fragrant flowers, fountains, and beauty. Now it goes to say that in a place like that, at a time like that, what is born from that was a God who had infinite compassion. Infinite compassion. Infinite light and perfection. The name of this God is Balder, and he grew up surrounded by the spirit of his father, the spirit, the breath, and the love of Frigga, his mother. These were the golden days of Asgard, and wherever he went, people will know health, peace of mind, joy, deep, deep joy. And his laughter was like a river. And there was nothing at that time that could ever enter into Asgard, as Heimdall the Watcher was always close to the Rainbow Bridge, listening out. There were no giants in sight. But at a time like this, time passed in splendor and joy and love and the sound of laughter. But one night in the halls of Balder's halls, one night a nightmare called the Night Wait entered. Somehow it had entered into the bedchamber of Balder, and there it entered into his mind. And Balder could foresee, and he saw images of trees burning, images of gods being filled with rage, of volcanoes erupting, of ships made of fingernails, images of dragons roaming over an ashen land. At a time like this. And at the beginning, there wasn't a problem as such. The nightmares came, but they started to become relentless. And he would often wake up and shiver and shake. And he couldn't get rid of this night wait that had entered the halls. And that's when he spoke to his mother, Frigg. And Frigga received the information, and she was immediately, in her motherly role, she immediately decided to go to all the different directions of all the worlds and proclaim that nothing should harm Balder, not the nightmares, not the snakes, not the clouds, not the sun rays. Everything should leave the God of infinite compassion, and he should be protected. And it so happened that snakes and gods and everyone around the world, in all the worlds, made an oath not to harm Balder, not to even, never to harm him. And that was to great joy in Asgard, because each time something would fly towards him or anything would happen in the world, he would always curve. He would never come to his harm. So there was a bit of a game, became a bit of a game around this. But there was one thing that troubled Spirit, that troubled Odin. He couldn't figure out why these images kept happening or were happening to Balder. The images in his mind, rather. It was like as if the God of infinite compassion was tarnished, like a gold is tarnished. So he made a great meeting under the boughs of Yggdrasil, in the landscapes there, in the plains, which the grasslands that grow under the boughs of Yggdrasil. And there the gods met, and they spoke about this, the nightmares that Balder had had. Now that they thought he was protected, of course, matters were not so urgent. But Odin, he decided to take the Hell Road, which meant he decided to go and travel down to meet, down in the underworld, to meet the völva, to meet the witch who could tell him about the future of his son and what it had in store. He wanted to find out this knowledge. So Odin saddled Sleipnir, and he went on his 8-legged horse across the Rainbow Bridge towards the land of the dead, towards the misty lands. He crossed the rivers of grief. He crossed the rivers of conflict. He crossed all of the paths that the dead make. He came to the great walls of Helheim, of the ancestral realm, and there he drove his horse to the northeast gate. And just before entering that northeast gate, there was a mound, and he knew under that mound there was an ancient witch that slept there and had all the knowledge, the first völva, all the prophecy that we hear in the Eddas. And he stamped his staff on the ground, and he said, "This is Odin. This is Odin. I have crossed the bloodhound with blood on his breast. I am standing here in the mist of Helheim before the gates, and I want you to wake from your grave, völva. I want you to rise and tell me some answers to my questions." And this is what the poetic Edda says. I'll recite. Then Odin rode to the eastern door, and there he knew well was a wise woman's grave. Magic he spoke, and mighty charms, till spellbound she rose. Long was I dead, she said, and in death she spoke. What is this man who is to me unknown? She replied as she rose from the dead. Who has made this troubled road down into the world of the dead? And then Odin said, Vegtam is my name, which means the wanderer. Vegtam, and I am Valtam's son. Of course, he is none of this. And he speak of a heaven that I know. And he said, can you please tell me if the benches in Helheim are bright with gold, and if they are decked with gold? And then the wise woman responded, and I quote from Poetic Edda, "Here for Balder the mead is brewed, the shining drink, and a shield lies over it. But their hope is gone from the mighty gods. Unwilling I speak, and now can I be still. Odin responded, again I quote from the Edda, "Wise woman, seize not. I seek from thee all I know, that I fain would ask, who shall be the bane of Balder? Who shall steal the life of Odin's son?" And the wise woman spoke. "The far-famed branch shall be his bane, and from that vengeance shall win for this evil work, and bring to the flames the slayer of Balder." Then the wise woman spoke and said, "Rind bears valley in Vestrasalir, and one night old fights Odin's son. His hands he shall not wash, his hair he shall not comb out, until the slayer of Balder he brings to the flames. Unwilling I spake, and now I would be still. The witch is pleading to be still." Then Odin says, "Wise woman, seize not. I seek from thee all that I know. What maidens are they who shall weep and toss to the sky the yards of the sails?" Then the wise woman say, "You are not the wanderer that you claim to be. You are Odin, the ancient sacrifice." And then Odin said, well, she responded, "Please ride home, because soon you too shall visit Helheim. Soon there shall be no more. And home ride now, Odin, and then until Loki wanders, until the chains are broken, until the last strife, the destroyers will come." And with that, Odin realized that it was Loki that had risen from those mounds. Now, whilst Odin was down in Helheim, speaking to shape-shifting völvas or Loki, in case it's always ambiguous, one can never be sure. Loki himself was the blood brother of Odin. Loki himself was the uncle of Balder. And Loki, in his raven feathered cloak, in his fox-skinned scarf around his neck, with his eyes that were like the colors of an iPad, where his face you can never be sure what he was thinking. Loki was not so keen on the infinite, compassionate God. Loki was not so keen on perfections and the bright bells of the sky. He was not so keen on all of this high pleasures of Asgard, where it was sung in harps, where things were meditative. Loki wanted something else. He was furious about Balder. His interior was plotting. Whilst Odin was away, he shapeshifted into an old woman, and he visited the watery temples of Frigga. And he came in as an old hag, an old crone. And he spoke to Frigga, and Frigga was caught unawares. And he spoke about this fantastic thing, that everything is protecting Balder. And he said how wonderful it was. And they sat there and they probably had some tea together when Loki, now disguised as an old woman, he did say, "But surely there must have been something in the worlds that couldn't pledge an oath for Balder." And then Frigga, she said, well, there was a young tender shoot, a young tender plant that's too young to make such a pledge, too slender. And it's the bright famed branch, that we heard the völva speak of from the mound. And Frigga said, in this bright famed branch, it's the mistletoe that grows in some parts of Asgard. The mistletoe did not make the oath to protect Balder. Now, once the old woman, or Loki, had heard that news, he left the watery temples of Frigga. And there he wandered out into Asgard, and he sought that tender shoot, the bright famed branch. And he saw it, and with it he started to cut a small stick of an arrow, straight, and he carved it carefully. And he said to himself, as all the gods are playing with Balder, throwing weapons at him, using it as a sport, as a game, he thought in his own mind that maybe I can persuade one of them to shoot this stick, this little arrow that I've made. And as he sat in his dark thoughts, drinking dark meads, drinking dark red wine, old wine from the barrels, all throughout the night, the thought became more and more strong in his spirit and his mind, that the next day, when the gods were playing, when Balder was out, and they would throw an axe at him or something like that to show how protected he was, he thought, I will go, and I will, with my cunning, I will see what I can do. And that morning he rose early, and as he stood there on the plains, he saw Balder, and he saw the gods, and there they were all together playing and laughing. And once in a while, someone, as the gods were, many of them would play and fight together. Often there would be a sword that will go towards Balder or something like that. It would curve away from him. And then as he saw in the distance, he saw one of the brothers, one of the big gods, his name is Hörnir the Blind. And Hörnir the Blind was sitting, who would never participate in any games. And he looked upon Hörnir the Blind, and he said to him, listen, all the gods are playing, all the gods are having all the fun. Why don't you have a bit of fun and try this bow that I have made and put an arrow to its string? And why don't you see if you can hit Balder with this arrow? And Hörnir said, sure. I have sat here listening to the laughing. I want to see how protected Balder is too. And with that, he took the arrow to the bowstring, and he told the blind god, the god with the blind strife, he told him to aim to the northwest. He told him to aim sharply, and he held his bow, and he helped him to pull the string back. And just as he let go, that black arrow of mistletoe, that black stick, flew in the air, and it went straight into Balder's heart and killed him instantly. At that moment, there was a breath in Asgard. There was a feeling of utter devastation of what had happened. And suddenly, Loki could not be seen. He was gone. But instead, under the bright bell of the sky, laid Balder with a stick of the mistletoe deep in his chest. And there was nobody home. His eyes were open, but there was nobody home. His spirit had gone. Upon hearing the death of Balder, all of nature, all of the worlds would forever have a sense of melancholy. And the God of infinite compassion, the God of light, the God of goodness, was no longer living amongst the world of the gods. He had now traversed the worlds into the land of the dead, into the land of the chthonic, into the underworld. That's where his light was going. And Frigga, hearing the news, and all the gods, they wept and they had great grief, great sorrow. And that funeral that they arranged was now one of the greatest funerals that has ever been made in all the worlds. Because laying Balder down, they took his great ship called the Ringhorn, and they filled it with so many gifts, that it was one of the, no one, not even Thor, could lift this ship. And all the people that gathered around the bay where the ship was laid on the beach, all the people came, all the gods came, the trolls came, the giants came, the animals came, the Valkyries came, the dwarves were there, all the Valkyries were there, all the giants were there, all of creation gathered for Balder. Not a giant could lift this Ringhorn. No one can push this boat out to sea. So what its weight of gifts, of libations, of bloods. And the greatest libation of all was, of course, Balder's wife, Nanna, who died of a heartbreak, and she laid next to him on that funeral pyre of the ship. But suddenly there was one guest that could move this ship. Her name was Hyrrokin, a giantess who arrived riding on a wolf with the reins of serpents. Half her face was burnt, the other half was contorted, and she stood there looking at the gods as if, absolutely, this is not a problem for me. And she just took the back of the ship and she pushed, and as she did, there was earthquakes, there was shaking of the grounds, and she took the ship and she pushed it out to sea. And that is when it rose out on that glimmering water towards the west. And it was a candle, they say, under this dark clouds which seethes with lightning. And there Balder's ship burnt, and all the creation watched the ship. It should be added that just before the ship went to the horizon, a mystery, Odin, spirit, had whispered something in the ear of Balder, and only Odin knows what he said. And as the ship was standing under those dark clouds, filled like a candle, all of creation would chant. All of creation would chant the old songs. Now Frigga was beyond herself with grief. She could never be. It took for a long time. She was incapable of bearing this burden. So she called out and said that, I want my son back. Balder needs to come back to the world of the gods where he belongs. I need someone who has the courage of 1,000 men to come forward. And I want that person to ride, to take my husband, to take Odin's horse and ride not to the gates of Helheim, but ride through Helheim into the world of the dead and negotiate with Hel, the goddess of death herself. Negotiate in terms in which Balder can come back. There's got to be something that we can negotiate for his spirit to return. Now, the world of the dead received a lot of light when Balder arrived. I spoke of fragrances in Asgard before when this story started. I spoke of the beauty there. But what Balder brought to Helheim were the sacred apples, the sacred orchards, and the laughter, and the rivers, and the waterfalls, and the beauty, and the light that he had as he sat on his bright gold benches deep in Helheim with his wife Nanna. So there he was, the God of infinite compassion in the depths of the chthonic worlds, in the underworlds. But as Frigga called out for the one who has the courage of 1,000 men, one such hero appeared, and his name is Hermod, Hermode, Hermod, which effectively means a courage of an army or a courage of an entire legion. And she said, take Sleipnir, now cross across the bridges and go and negotiate with Hel. And he took the reins, he saddled Sleipnir, and off he went. And Sleipnir had the ways, it was capable of galloping onto the Rainbow Bridge, down towards the underworld. It crossed the rivers of grief. It crossed the rivers of conflict. It crossed the steely bridge in towards the walls of Helheim. There he went to the northeastern gate where Odin had just been. And there it saw the great hound that protects the gate with blood on its chest. And it leapt over the hound, Gamr. It leapt over the hound. It continued to gallop down to the heart of Helheim. And there Hermod finally arrived in front of Balder and Nanna, his wife. And he pleaded to Hel, the goddess of death. I have come on behalf of Frigga, Balder's mother. I am here to say, is there any terms that the gods can make? Is there any negotiation that the gods can make in order for Balder's spirit, in order for Balder to return to the land of the living heart? And Hel said, yes, there is one thing. There is one thing. If you want the god of Balder to return to the land of the living heart, if you want the world to shine with his wisdom, there is one thing. But everything must do it. Everything must learn to grieve for Balder's loss properly. That means that the tears have to fall onto the ground of Middle Earth, of Vanaheim, of Asgard, of all the different worlds. Everyone has to learn to grieve. Only then would I set him free from the land of the dead. And with that, Hermod spent the night in Helheim with Balder and his wife. And then he took Sleipnir, his horse, and he was given the gates open And he went and he galloped all the way back to Asgard. And as he came back, he said to Frigga, he said, look, you have asked every creature, every being you have asked not to harm Balder. And only one thing couldn't make the oath. But this time, if you want Balder's spirit back in all the worlds, you need to ask all of creation to learn to grieve deeply for his death. And Frigga thought, right. She started to say, send all the gods to all four directions. Tell the snakes to start crying for Balder. Tell the clouds to start crying for Balder. Tell all the world to begin grieving for Balder. Leave no one. Even the rocks will have to grieve for Balder. And absolutely, everything heard the message. The gods were crying, the rocks were crying, the snakes were crying, the deer were crying, the rivers were crying. And you all know, when you go at dusk into that woodland, when you cross the landscapes in an afternoon, when the light is playing amongst the trees, you all have experienced the deep melancholy, the deep longing for Balder, for life and love in this precarious world, in these precarious, dangerous worlds. And everything agreed, and everything started to weep, everything, the whole of creation. And Hermod, the one who had the courage of thousands, went and came past a cave. And in that cave was a giantess, not so dissimilar from the first völva outside of the northeastern gate of Helheim. Not so dissimilar. And he spoke to this giantess, whose name was Tok. And he said, will you grieve for Balder? Will your tears touch the ground for Balder? And this giantess said, my tears will be dry for Balder. Let Helheim have, let Helheim keep. My eyes will be dry. And with that, Hermod knew that he had no chance of ever bringing the light back from Helheim, back into the worlds, because her name was ungratefulness, unthankfulness. That was her spirit that lives in all of us. And that spirit refused to grieve for Balder, refused to shed any tears. It was bitter. It was a bitter spirit, full of judgment, full of judgment. When Frigga learned that this spirit was still in the worlds, Balder was kept in the underworld, in his light, until Ragnarök. But the gods found out soon enough who had caused this pain. They found out soon enough who had directed this arrow. They understood that this arrow was shot not by the blind god, but instead it was shot by the trickster who had told him to put this mistletoe arrow on its bowstring. So blind strife can kill the light. And ungratefulness and bitterness can keep it in the dark. So the gods understood that Loki had been cunning and plotting So immediately they wondered where he'd gone. And of course he'd disappeared the moment Balder had died. There was no Loki in sight during the funeral. And as he had disappeared, he had gone to a place where he could see from all directions. And he had gone to a place called the Fanagang Falls, which is this immense pool of deep water. And his house, he could see from all places, the north, the south, the west, the east. And during the day, just to be sure, he would hide as a salmon, deep, deep in the water, underneath the waterfall, the Fanagang Falls, as a big silvery salmon. And at night, he would sit in his house or tower, and he would look out, just in case he would see any of the gods arriving. And as he sat there, he didn't feel shame, he didn't feel remorse. But as he sat there, he was plotting and wondering whether the gods could actually find him as a salmon, whether they could find him as a shapeshifter. He was worried about it. So he asked himself the question, what would I do if I needed to catch Loki? If I wanted to catch a salmon? And whilst he was thinking about it, there was this yarn of nettle fiber. And in the ancient time, they were used as fishing nets. And he took the nettle fiber and he started to make this great net out of it. And he started to weigh it and to see if this net could be something that could catch him when he was a salmon. And as he was doing this, he was drinking his dark wine, he was wondering to himself and he was looking out. The moment he started to make the net, the gods started to approach his tower, coming for him. They had found his whereabouts. And there he sat and he threw the net in the fire. He drained his wine and he ran out towards the deep pool of the Fanagang Falls, and he became this glittering silvery salmon, and down he went, hidden from view. Down he went to the mud flats of the pool. The gods then entered and saw that Loki had been there just 15 minutes ago, and one of them entered, a god that some of you may have heard as I'm telling the story, all of these stories, Kvasir. Kvasir, the god that was made out of the god of wisdom, that was made from the tears and from the spit of all the different gods, the god that contained all the wisdom of all the gods. He stood there and he said, I think I know what's happening. And he touched the ashes and he saw the patterns, the threaded patterns of the nettle fibers. And he said, Loki has been making a net. And with that, Thor responded, let's not have idle thoughts. We need to move on. We need to catch Loki. This is just thinking in riddles. But Kvasir was the wisest of them all. He said, no, I think he burnt the net because he saw us coming. And by burning the net, he was trying to hide from us that in fact he could be as a shape of a fish. So the gods then walked to the Fanagang Falls, and they brought with them this old nettle yarn. And with that, they started to work this intricate web. And they made it an enormous fishing net. And as they put it into the pool, Thor himself would wade into the depths and to try and scoop up whatever fish was there. But no luck, because the salmon was hiding in the mud flats. So they then had to put rocks underneath the net to weigh it down. And then all the gods would walk in towards the pool. And as they were walking, suddenly, splash, the salmon flew out of the water as if he was swimming up the current of the waterfall. But just like a bear, Thor took the salmon in his hands and held it tight and kept it like that. And as they walked out of the pool, the salmon struggled to breathe in the air, and not before long, it was Loki that Thor was carrying. And the gods took Loki, and for the crime that he'd committed, under the bright bell of the sky, as the sun, Sunna as witness, in the broad daylight, they took him straight away from the light into the deepest cave. And there they laid him down. And Loki then would be transported into a whole other story. But before I go, his children and his wife were present. And they bound Loki. They started to figure out how to bind him there. And now we would leave Loki in the cave, because we're entering into another myth cycle, into another story. So we leave him there in the dark of that cave. So let the waves rise, let the stars rise, and let the flames leap. And if your hearts are wise, this story is for you to keep.